good evening. Or perhaps, given the nature of our journey tonight, good isn't quite the right word. Let's settle for welcome. I am Eli Nightfall, and it's a distinct pleasure to have your company once more as we prepare to part the veil between the world you know and the unsettling realms that pulse just beneath its skin. Tonight, we explore a fear that is both primal and deeply personal, one that often takes root in the most sacred of spaces, the childhood bedroom. It's a place of whispered secrets, of burgeoning dreams, and sometimes of things that whisper back from the shadows. Our story is called The Thing Under the Bed. Slight pause. The crackling fire is the only sound. The whispers started subtly, like the rustle of dry leaves skittering across an attic floor, or the almost inaudible sigh of a house settling in the deep quiet of night. For 7-year-old Leo Miller, they were the first intimations of a new friendship, a secret world that blossomed in the shadowy expanse beneath his race-car-themed bed. He called his new friend Nibbles. It was a comforting name. Sarah thought, when Leo first mentioned him, something small and perhaps a little timid. The kind of companion a boy on the cusp of shedding his toddlerhood for the more serious business of second-grade might conjure. Mark, ever the pragmatist, had ruffled Leo's sandy hair and chuckled. "Making friends already, buddy? That's my boy." Their house, a 2-story colonial with a welcoming, if slightly faded, yellow clapboard exterior, sat on a quiet, tree-lined street in a suburb that prided itself on its ordinariness. It was the kind of place where an imaginary friend felt like a perfectly normal milestone, a harmless flourish of a developing mind. Leo was a bright, inquisitive child, prone to elaborate stories and grand pronouncements. His imagination a vibrant landscape Sarah and Mark encouraged. So, Nibbles was welcomed into the family lore with the same gentle indulgence they'd shown to Captain Astro, Leo's previous astronaut-themed alter ego. "Nibbles says hello," Leo would announce at the breakfast table, his mouth full of cereal, eyes wide and earnest. "Oh, does he?" Sarah would reply, pouring coffee. "Well, tell Nibbles hello from us. He says you have nice hair, Mommy." "That's very kind of him." The early days of Nibbles were filled with such innocuous exchanges. Leo would spend hours in his room, ostensibly playing with his building blocks or action figures, but a low murmur of conversation, Leo's voice, and then expectant pauses would drift down the hallway. He'd report Nibbles' preferences. He didn't like broccoli, but loved strawberries, just like Leo. His opinions, cartoons were fun, but loud noises were scary. And his nightly activities, Nibbles, apparently never slept but kept watch. It was during one of these nightly watchings that the first ripple of unease disturbed the placid surface of Sarah's maternal calm. Leo had been tucked in. Story read, kisses exchanged. The house was sinking into its nocturnal rhythm, the hum of the refrigerator a familiar drone. Sarah was downstairs, finishing up some emails when a small sound, a distinct thump, echoed from Leo's room. Not loud enough to be a fall, but definite. She paused, listened. Silence. Then, another thump, softer this time, followed by Leo's giggle. She found him sitting up in bed, a wide grin on his face, his eyes sparkling in the dim glow of his rocket ship nightlight. "What's going on, sweetie?" "I heard a noise." Leo pointed under the bed. Nibbles was playing. He dropped his pebble. "His pebble?" "Uh-huh. He likes to tap it. To say goodnight." Leo's gaze drifted to the dark space beneath his bed frame, a space usually cluttered with forgotten socks and rogue toy cars. "He says goodnight to you too, Mommy." Sarah forced a smile. "That's nice. But it's time for sleep now, okay? For you and for Nibbles." She smoothed his covers, her hand lingering on his forehead. He felt a little warm, but then he often did after the excitement of playtime. She peered under the bed, seeing nothing but the usual shadows and the faint outline of a lost sneaker. No pebbles, just the pervasive, slightly dusty smell of an area seldom reached by the vacuum cleaner. The pebbles, however, became a recurring theme. Leo would often talk about Nibbles' collection, stored, he said, in a special soft place under the bed. Sometimes, Sarah would hear what sounded like tiny clicks or taps from his room. sounds she attributed to the house settling or perhaps Leo fidgeting. Mark, when she mentioned it, suggested it was probably just mice in the walls, an old house thing. He promised to set some traps, though he never quite got around to it. Then came a cold spot. Leo's room had always been one of the warmer ones in the house, especially in the summer, catching the afternoon sun. But one sweltering July afternoon, Sarah went in to gather Leo's laundry and was struck by a distinct chill emanating from the area around his bed. It was localized, almost as if an invisible window had been left open, letting in a pocket of refrigerated air. She checked the actual window. It was closed tight. The air conditioning vent was on the other side of the room. She knelt, reaching a hand under the bed. The air there was noticeably colder, almost icy. "Leo," she called, a tremor of something she couldn't name in her voice. "Have you noticed it's cold in here?" Lau, engrossed in a drawing at his little desk, looked up. "Nibbles likes it cold. He says it reminds him of his old home." "His old home?" Sarah pressed, trying to keep her tone light. "Where was that?" Leo shrugged, a typically vague 7-year-old gesture. "Under. Just under." He then added, with a gravity that was unsettling, "He says the warm makes him sleepy tired. Not good tired." That evening, the whispers seemed to change. Not Leo's whispers to his unseen friend, but something else, something Sarah almost convinced herself she was imagining. While Leo was in the bath, splashing and narrating an elaborate naval battle with his bath toys, Sarah tidied his room. As she bent to pick up a stray sock near the bed, just the distant sounds of Leo's happy shrieks and Mark clattering dishes downstairs. She told herself it was the wind, a draft, her own mind playing tricks. But the unease planted by the cold spot and the phantom whisper began to take root. She started paying closer attention to Leo's descriptions of Nibbles. They were becoming more detailed. Nibbles, Leo explained, didn't have eyes like people did. His were like shiny buttons but dark. He didn't have hands but long fingers like twigs but soft. And he didn't talk with a mouth, but in your head like a quiet song. These descriptions, delivered with Leo's unwavering conviction, painted a picture far removed from the fluffy bunny or brave knight she might have expected an imaginary friend to be. There was an alien quality to Nibbles, an otherness that pricked at the edges of her comfort. The playful interactions she'd initially observed also began to shift. Leo seemed less in control of the games. Sometimes, she'd find him sitting on his bed, looking pale and anxious, his gaze fixed on the space beneath. "What's wrong, honey?" she'd ask. "Nibbles wants me to stay here," he'd say, his voice small. "He doesn't like it when I go." Or, more worryingly, "Nibbles is hungry. He says the strawberries aren't enough anymore. What else does he want to eat?" Sarah would ask, a knot tightening in her stomach. Leo would just shake his head, his eyes wide with a nascent fear. "He won't tell me. He just says soon." The change in Leo was subtle at first, but undeniable. He, who had always been an energetic, boisterous boy, started to become more subdued, more watchful. Dark circles began to appear under his eyes, as if he wasn't sleeping well, though he never complained of nightmares. He just seemed tired, and increasingly, he seemed afraid of the very space that housed his special friend. The whispers from beneath the bed were no longer just Leo's. They were becoming something else, something that felt chillingly, impossibly real. And they were growing stronger. They were setting the stage for a horror that none of them could yet fathom, a darkness coalescing just out of sight, preparing to make its presence known in ways that would shatter their ordinary world forever. The true nature of Nibbles was yet to be unveiled, but the air in Leo's room was growing heavy with anticipation, cold with a presence that was steadily, patiently, making itself at home. And soon, very soon, it would ask for more than just strawberries. Much more. Chapter 1. Whispers from Beneath. The shadows under Leo's bed had always been a place of mild fascination, a dusty, unexplored territory where lost socks and forgotten toy soldiers went to retire. But recently, those shadows had gained a new resident, a companion Leo spoke of with a mixture of childish reverence and an almost conspiratorial glee. He called him Nibbles. Sarah Miller, Leo's mother, first heard the name on a bright Saturday morning, the scent of pancakes and coffee filling their sunlit kitchen. Leo, perched on his booster's seat, his chin barely clearing the table, announced, "Nibbles says the syrup is very good today." Sarah exchanged an amused glance with her husband, Mark, who was hidden behind the sports section of the local paper. "Oh, really?" Sarah said, playing along as she refilled Leo's small glass of orange juice. "And who is Nibbles, sweetie?" Leo beamed, a smear of syrup glistening on his upper lip. "He's my friend. He lives under my bed. He's very quiet, mostly, except when he's hungry." Mark lowered his paper, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Under your bed? Huh? Crowded down there, is it?" Leo nodded seriously. "He likes it. It's dark. He says the light hurts his... well, he doesn't have eyes like ours, Daddy. They're different." This pronouncement, delivered with the solemnity only a 7-year-old can muster, was met with another shared smile between his parents. An imaginary friend. It was a classic childhood phase, one Sarah had read about in parenting magazines, and Mark remembered vaguely from his own nephew's tall tales about a talking giraffe. It seemed harmless enough, a testament to Leo's burgeoning imagination. Over the following weeks, Nibbles became a fixture in their household, at least in conversation. Leo would narrate Nibbles' opinions on everything from the television shows he watched. Nibbles thinks the blue dinosaur is too shouty, to the texture of his mashed potatoes. Nibbles says they need more butter. Like clouds, he'd save small portions of his snacks, a broken cookie, a few grapes, the crust of his sandwich, and carefully place them on a paper napkin, which he would then slide under the edge of his bed before nap time or at night. For Nibbles, he'd explain, his brow furrowed with concentration. Sarah would find these little offerings later, sometimes untouched, sometimes gone, which she attributed to the inevitable mouse, or simply Leo forgetting and tidying them himself. The house was old, small, unseen creatures were to be expected. Mark, less involved in the daily minutiae of Leo's imaginative play, would occasionally ask, "How's old Nibbles doing?" And Leo would launch into a detailed, if somewhat rambling, account of Nibbles' latest silent adventures. The descriptions of Nibbles remained curiously consistent, yet frustratingly vague. He was long and shadowy, soft like dust. Leo's room was at the end of the upstairs hallway, a cozy space painted a cheerful sky blue, with glow-in-the-dark stars pasted on the ceiling. His bed, a sturdy wooden frame with a headboard shaped like a smiling cartoon car, was pushed against the far wall. Beneath it, the space was perhaps a foot high, obscured by a thick valance that matched his duvet cover. It was into this unseen cavern that Leo's attention seemed increasingly drawn. He would lie on his stomach, his head and shoulders disappearing under the valance, and conduct hushed, one-sided conversations. Sarah, passing his open door, would hear him. "Are you comfy, Nibbles?" "Oh, good. Yes. I like red cars, too." "No. Mommy says I can't have ice cream before dinner." It was endearing, she thought, this dedication to his unseen friend. It was only when the character of these interactions began to subtly shift that the first, almost imperceptible, seed of unease was planted in her mind. The hushed tones became more urgent. Leo's side of the conversation filled with more questions than statements. "Are you sure? But why? That doesn't sound very nice, Nibbles." One afternoon, Sarah found Leo sitting on the edge of his bed, his small shoulders slumped, his usual bright expression clouded. His favorite red fire truck lay abandoned on the floor. "What's wrong, bud?" she asked, sitting beside him and stroking his hair. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the patterned rug. "Nibbles is sad today," he mumbled. "He says he's lonely." Sarah's heart gave a small pang. "Oh, sweetie. Well, he has you, doesn't he? That's not lonely." Leo shook his head. "He says it's a different kind of lonely. He misses the dark." Sarah frowned. "But it's dark under your bed, isn't it?" Leo finally looked up at her, his blue eyes troubled. "He says it's not dark enough. He wants more dark." This was a new, slightly unsettling turf phrase. "More dark?" she repeated gently. "What does that mean?" Leo shrugged, his small face a mask of confusion. "I don't know. He just says it, and he's hungry again." always hungry. The food offerings under the bed had indeed been disappearing with more regularity. Sarah had even noticed a faint, slightly musty odor emanating from beneath the valance when she changed Leo's sheets, a smell she initially dismissed as old dust and perhaps forgotten apple cores. She made a mental note to do a thorough clean-out under there when Leo was at school. Mark remained largely unfazed by these developments. "He's just being a kid, Sarah," he'd say when she voiced her faint concerns. "They have wild imaginations. He'll grow out of it. Remember when he insisted he could talk to squirrels? This is just the next thing." Mark was a structural engineer, a man of logic and tangible realities. The notion of an entity named Nibbles demanding more dark was, to him, simply the creative ramblings of their son. He was more concerned with the persistent draft he couldn't locate in the living room and the rising cost of property taxes. Yet, even Mark had to admit Leo's commitment to Nibbles was impressive. The boy never wavered in his belief, never let slip that it was just a game. His conversations with the space under his bed were earnest, his concern for Nibbles' well-being genuine. The whispers, too, were becoming more noticeable, or perhaps Sarah was just listening more intently. When Leo was in his room, supposedly playing quietly, she would sometimes hear not just his clear, childish voice, but a softer, sibilant counterpoint. It was almost like the sound of someone breathing very close to a microphone, a dry, rustling sound. She'd strain her ears, trying to discern actual words, but it remained stubbornly indistinct, a mere impression of sound. When she asked Leo if Nibbles was talking back to him, he would nod. "Yes, but he talks inside my head, remember? You can't hear him like I can." This explanation, while fitting the established narrative, did little to quell the faint disquiet that was beginning to coil in Sarah's stomach. It was the specificity that got to her. The way Leo described Nibbles' aversion to light, his strange eyes, his diet, his constant hunger, it felt less like invention and more like reporting. As if Leo were merely relaying facts about a creature he genuinely knew. One evening, as Sarah was tucking Leo in, he clutched her hand tightly. "Mommy," he whispered, his eyes darting towards the floor. "Nibbles says he wants to meet you." Sarah smiled, a little strained. "Oh, he does? Well, maybe someday. But right now it's sleepy time." Leo shook his head, his grip tightening. "No, he means now. He says he's tired of just me." A small chill traced its way down Sarah's spine. There was an urgency in Leo's voice she hadn't heard before, a flicker of something that might have been fear. "Leo, sweetie, Nibbles is your special friend. He doesn't need to meet Mommy and Daddy." She tried to keep her voice light, reassuring. But Leo's eyes were wide and unblinking. He says if he doesn't meet someone else soon, he might get too hungry, and then he might get angry. The words hung in the air of the cheerful blue room, suddenly stripping it of its innocence. The glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling seemed to mock her with their silent, distant light. "Too hungry for what, Leo?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Leo just stared at the floor, at the shadowed space beneath his bed, and a single tear traced a path down his cheek. "He won't say," he choked out. "He just feels it." Sarah pulled him close, her own heart now thudding with a nameless apprehension. She told herself it was just a nightmare spilling into waking hours, a child's fear of the dark manifesting in a new, more elaborate way. But as she held her son, she couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers from beneath the bed were no longer just a product of Leo's imagination. Something else was down there, and it was indeed getting hungry. The musty odor she'd noticed before seemed stronger tonight, tinged with something else, something vaguely rotten. The next morning, the unease from the previous night still clung to Sarah like a shroud. Leo, however, seemed to have bounced back, his usual cheerful self as he chattered about a dream involving a talking school bus that flew to the moon. He made no mention of Nibbles or his unsettling demands. Sarah, watching him smear jam on his toast with gusto, tried to convince herself that she'd overreacted. Kids said strange things. Their fears were often outsized, their pronouncements dramatic. Yet, She couldn't quite shake the image of Leo's tear-streaked face or the genuine fear in his eyes. She resolved to have that thorough clean-out under his bed as soon as he left for school. Perhaps demystifying the space, exposing it to light and air, would help dispel whatever anxieties were brewing in Leo's mind and her own. As the yellow school bus rumbled away from the curb, for heaven's sake, taking a breath, she pushed the door open. The room was bright with morning sunlight, dust motes dancing in the beams, slanting through the window. The cheerful blue walls seemed to mock her apprehension. She knelt and lifted the valance. The flashlight beam cut through the dimness. Several crumpled paper napkins, the remnants of Nibbles' meals, and something else. Tucked away in the farthest, darkest corner, almost against the wall, was a small, peculiar pile. It consisted of dried leaves, small twigs, bits of fluff that looked like drier lint, and glinting dully in the flashlight beam, several smooth, dark pebbles. Leo's description of Nibbles' pebble collection flashed through her mind. It was undeniably odd, this curated little nest. Where had he even found pebbles like that? They didn't have any in their garden. As she began to clear out the space, sweeping the debris into her bag, she noticed the smell more acutely. It wasn't just dust and old food. There was an underlying current, a faint, sickly sweet odor, like overripe fruit beginning to turn. And the cold, even with the sun streaming into the room. The air directly under the bed felt significantly cooler, a pocket of unnatural chill. She ran her hand along the wooden floorboards. They were smooth, a little dusty, but otherwise unremarkable. No obvious source for the cold or the smell. Then, her fingers brushed against something sticky. She recoiled, then aimed the flashlight more directly. There on the floorboards, near where the strange pile had been, was a patch of translucent, slimy residue. It was about the size of her hand, glistening wetly. It hadn't been there before. She was sure of it. It looked almost like snail slime, but thicker, and it carried that faint, rotten sweet smell more strongly. A wave of nausea washed over her. What on earth was that? She quickly wiped it up with a paper towel, which came away stained a pale, yellowish green. Her skin crawled. Mark arrived home that evening to find Sarah unusually quiet, her brow furrowed in thought. She waited until after Leo was asleep, his breathing soft and regular from his room down the hall, before she recounted what she'd found. She showed him the discolored paper towel, now sealed in a plastic bag. He examined it with a skeptical frown. Probably just some spilled juice and mold, sir, he said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. Or maybe he had a bug collection under there or something. You know how boys are. But the description of the cold, the smell, and Leo's increasing anxiety visibly unsettled him. The slime, Mark, Sarah insisted. It wasn't food. It was, I don't know what it was. And those pebbles, exactly like he described Nibbles having. Mark ran a hand through his hair. Okay, look, it's weird. I'll grant you that. But there's got to be a rational explanation. Maybe there's a draft under there, making it cold. Maybe some animal got in and left that. A raccoon, a possum. Sarah shook her head. The window screen is intact, and it didn't smell like any animal I know. That night, Mark decided to humor Leo and have a little chat with Nibbles himself. After tucking Leo in, he knelt beside the bed. So, Nibbles, he said, his voice overly hearty, trying to project into the space beneath. Leo tells me you're a pretty interesting guy. Silence. Leo, propped up on his elbows, watched with wide, expectant eyes. Not much of a talker, Mark continued, feeling increasingly foolish. He reached his hand under the valance, patting the floor. Anything you want to tell me, buddy? As his hand moved through the darkness, he felt it, that same unnatural pocket of cold. It was distinct, like plunging his arm into a refrigerator. His jovial expression wavered, and then he heard it, or rather, felt it, as much as heard it. A low, guttural vibration, almost a growl that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards beneath his hand. It was incredibly faint, so faint he might have dismissed it as the house settling. But it was accompanied by a sudden intensification of the cold and a wave of that sickly sweet odor, now more pronounced. more cloying. Mark snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. His heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at Leo, whose eyes were now filled with a familiar fear. "Daddy," Leo whispered, "Nibbles doesn't like it when you reach under there. He says it's his space." Mark stood up, forcing a shaky smile. "Right. Well, everyone needs their space, I guess." He made a hasty retreat, his earlier skepticism badly shaken. He didn't tell Sarah about the growl, or the intensity of the cold, or the way the smell had seemed to surge. He told himself he'd imagined it, that his own suggestibility, fueled by Sarah's anxiety, was getting the better of him. But he couldn't deny the prickle of unease that now crawled along his own skin. He found himself glancing at the closed door of Leo's room later that evening with a new, unwelcome apprehension. The silence from within seemed heavier, more charged than before. The small, unusual occurrences in Leo's room began to escalate. Toys left on his desk would be found on the floor, not simply fallen, but as if swiped by an unseen hand. The cold spot under the bed seemed to be expanding, the chill now noticeable even when standing several feet away. Leo himself was becoming more withdrawn, his sleep clearly disturbed. He'd wake up tired, with dark circles under his eyes, sometimes complaining of bad dreams he couldn't quite remember, only that they involved darkness and whispers. He spoke less of Nibbles' playful antics and more of his demands, his hunger. The portions of food he left under the bed were larger now, and they always disappeared completely, leaving behind only that faint, persistent, unpleasant odor. Sarah found herself constantly checking on him, her nights punctuated by anxious trips to his room just to listen to his breathing, to reassure herself he was okay. The happy, ordinary rhythm of their family life was subtly, insidiously being disrupted by the unseen, unspoken presence that had taken up residence in the shadows of their son's bedroom. The whispers were no longer just for Leo. They were beginning to seep into the quiet spaces of the house, a chilling undercurrent to their growing dread. Chapter 2. The Shifting Shadow. The following Saturday, Sarah decided a distraction was in order. The oppressive atmosphere in the house, particularly surrounding Leo's room, was becoming palpable. She suggested a family trip to the zoo, hoping a day of sunshine, animals, and normal childhood delights would help dispel the encroaching gloom and perhaps coax Leo out of his increasingly somber shell. Mark readily agreed, eager for any respite from the unspoken tension that had settled over their home. Leo, however, was strangely reluctant. "But what about Nibbles?" he asked, his lower lip trembling slightly. "He'll be all alone. He doesn't like being alone." Sarah knelt beside him, forcing a bright smile. "Nibbles will be just fine for a few hours, sweetie. He can have a nice long nap under your bed. We'll be back before he even knows we're gone." It took a good deal of persuasion and the promise of seeing the new tiger cubs to finally get Leo into his jacket and out the door. But even as they drove away, Sarah couldn't shake the image of Leo's anxious backward glance at his bedroom window, as if he were leaving a fragile dependent behind. The zoo trip was, on the surface, a success. Leo marveled at the monkeys, shrieked with delight at the roaring lions, and even managed a small smile when a playful seal splashed him. Yet, Sarah noticed a new wariness in him, a tendency to startle at sudden noises, his gaze often drifting to shadowed corners or dark enclosures with an unnerving intensity. When they passed the reptile house, he clutched her hand tightly. "Nibbles wouldn't like it in there," he whispered, his eyes wide. "Too many things looking." The things looking comment sent a fresh shiver down Sarah's spine. It was another one of those oddly specific, unsettling details that seemed to come from a place beyond typical childhood imagination. Back home, as evening began to settle, the house felt different. Or perhaps they were just more attuned to its subtle shifts. The air was heavy, and the faint, sickly sweet odor, which Sarah had hoped might dissipate with their absence, seemed to cling more tenaciously to the upstairs hallway. As Mark went to run Leo's bath, Sarah found herself drawn to Leo's room. She stood in the doorway, a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. The room looked normal enough, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. but the area around the bed felt colder. Definitely colder, and the shadows beneath the valance seemed deeper, more opaque than usual. She took a hesitant step inside. "Nibbles," she whispered, feeling utterly foolish. "Are you in there?" Only silence answered her, a silence that felt charged, expectant. Then a small sound, a soft, dragging noise, like fabric being pulled slowly across a rough surface. It came from under the bed. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was followed by another, similar sound, then a faint, almost inaudible click. Her heart hammered. Was it just Leo's forgotten toys shifting? Or was it something else? Later that evening, after Leo was asleep, Sarah recounted the sounds to Mark. He listened, his expression grim. The incident in Leo's room the previous night, his own unnerving experience with the cold and the low growl, had clearly eroded his skepticism. "I don't like this, Sarah," he said, his voice low. "I really don't like this. There's something wrong." He suggested they try to talk to Leo again, who had been happily dousing his pancakes in syrup, paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He looked from Sarah to Mark, his brow furrowing in concentration. "Well," he began slowly, "he's shadowy. Like if a shadow could be thicker, and he's long, very long. When he stretches out, he can reach all the way to my desk from under the bed." Sarah's blood ran cold. Leo's desk was a good 6 feet from his bed. And his fingers, Leo continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "They're like long, thin branches, but they're soft and a bit sticky. And they're cold. Always so cold." He shivered, despite the warmth of the kitchen. And his eyes, they're not like ours. They're shiny, like wet buttons, but dark, all dark. And sometimes they glow a little, just a tiny bit. When he's happy or hungry." Mark swallowed hard, his face pale. "And does he ever come out from under the bed, Leo?" Leo shook his head vehemently. "No, he doesn't like the light. It hurts him. He says the shadows are his home. He just reaches." He held up his own small hand, wiggling his fingers. "Like this, but longer. Much, much longer." The image this conjured, long, shadowy, sticky fingers reaching out from the darkness beneath an unsuspecting child's bed, was profoundly disturbing. It was no longer the vague, amorphous outline of an imaginary friend. It was a creature with defined, terrifying characteristics. Sarah felt a wave of dizziness. "Leo," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "has Nibbles ever touched you?" Leo hesitated, his gaze dropping to his lap. "Sometimes," he mumbled, "when he wants me to pass him food, or when he wants to tell me a secret." "And what does it feel like?" Mark pressed, his voice strained. Leo looked up, his eyes wide and troubled. "Cold," he whispered. So cold. And tingly, like when your foot falls asleep, but all over." That afternoon, while Leo was engrossed in a cartoon downstairs, Sarah, her heart pounding, found herself drawn back to his room. She had to know. She knelt beside the bed, took a deep breath, and lifted the valance. Armed with a powerful flashlight, she swept the beam across the dusty floorboards. The usual collection of lost items was there, but this time she noticed something new. Faint, almost invisible trails in the dust, as if something had been dragged or had dragged itself across the floor. And near the center, almost directly under where Leo's pillow would be, she saw it. A patch of the same slimy, translucent residue she had found before, but larger this time and fresher. It glistened wetly in the flashlight beam, and the sickly sweet odor was stronger here, almost cloying. As she stared at it, a profound sense of dread washed over her. This wasn't just a child's imagination. This was real. Something was living under Leo's bed. Something that left physical traces. Determined, Mark decided it was time for a more direct approach. That evening, after Leo was supposedly asleep, he went into his son's room. The air was frigid, the cold emanating from under the bed like a palpable wave. He knelt, just as he had before. "Nibbles," he said, his voice firm, trying to project authority he didn't feel. "This is Mark, Leo's dad. We need to talk." Silence. "And Leo is our son. You're not welcome here if you're going to scare him or harm him. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another few degrees. Mark could see his own breath misting in the dim light. And then a sound, not the low growl he'd heard before, but something different. A soft, almost wet, sighing sound followed by a distinct, deliberate scrape, as if something heavy, yet soft, was being dragged across the wooden floorboards directly beneath him. The sound was accompanied by an intensification of that rotten sweet odor. So strong now it made his eyes water. He felt a primal urge to flee, to snatch Leo from his bed and run from the house. But he stood his ground, his fists clenched. "Show yourself," he choked out, though his voice was barely a whisper. The scraping sound came again, closer this time, and then, from the very edge of the valance, a shadow seemed to deepen, to coalesce, to extend itself just an inch or two into the dim light of the room. It wasn't solid, not exactly. It was more like a distortion in the air, a patch of darkness more profound than the surrounding gloom. And from the edge of this deeper darkness, Mark saw, or thought he saw, the faintest hint of movement. Something long and thin and impossibly black, uncoiling slowly before just as quickly retracting back into the utter blackness beneath the bed. He didn't wait to see more. He backed out of the room, his heart pounding in his ears. The image of that shifting, reaching shadow burned into his mind. He closed Leo's door softly, then leaned against the hallway wall, trembling. The playful notion of an imaginary friend named Nibbles was gone, replaced by a terrifying, undeniable certainty. They were dealing with something far more sinister. Something that was not only real, but was actively, malevolently present in their home. Chapter 3, Nibbles' Hunger. The uneasy truce, if it could even be called that, shattered a few nights later. Sarah was jolted awake by a sound that was becoming horrifyingly familiar. Leo's whimpering cry. But this time, it was different, sharper, laced with a raw terror she hadn't heard before. She was out of bed in an instant, Mark close behind her, their bare feet thudding on the wooden floor as they raced to Leo's room. They burst through the door to a scene that would forever be seared into their memories. Leo was sitting bolt upright in bed, his small body trembling violently, his eyes wide and staring, not at them, but the space just beyond the foot of his bed. The room was freezing, the cold radiating from under the bed in icy waves. And the smell, the sickly sweet, rotten odor was overpowering, thick enough to taste. "Leo, what is it? What's wrong?" Sarah cried, rushing to his side. He didn't seem to hear her. He pointed a shaking finger towards the end of his bed. He's hungry, Mommy," Leo choked out, his voice hoarse with fear. "Nibbles is so hungry. He showed me." "Showed you what, sweetie? Showed you what?" Mark demanded, his gaze sweeping the dimly lit room, searching for any tangible threat. His eyes fell on the floor at the foot of Leo's bed. Lying there, stark against the pale blue rug, were several small, dead birds. 3 of them, sparrows by the look of it. Their necks were twisted at unnatural angles, their tiny bodies still and lifeless. A few feathers were scattered around them, and beneath them, a dark, wet stain was slowly seeping into the rug. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Where had they come from? The window was closed, the screen intact. "Leo," Mark said, his voice tight with a mixture of dread and anger. Did Nibbles do this?" Leo nodded, tears streaming down his face. "He brought them. From outside. He said he needed more than just cookies and strawberries." He buried his face in Sarah's side, his small body racked with sobs. He said if I didn't get him more, he'd be very, very angry. Mark, his face a mask of grim determination, carefully scooped up the dead birds with a piece of cardboard, his stomach churning. The implications were horrifying. Whatever was under that bed was capable of leaving its confined space, of venturing outside, of killing. And it was communicating its escalating needs to their son in the most gruesome way possible. The idea of an imaginary friend was now a cruel joke. This was a predator. Sarah held Leo close, murmuring reassurances she didn't feel, her own body trembling. The cold in the room was bone-chilling, the silence thick with an unseen menace. She could feel it, a palpable presence, watching them from the darkness beneath the bed, waiting. That night, Leo slept in their room, sandwiched between them, a small, shivering bundle. Neither Sarah nor Mark slept much, their minds racing, their ears straining for any sound from the now empty bedroom down the hall. The image of those dead birds, the thought of what else Nibbles might be hungry for, haunted the long, dark hours. The next day, a strained, fearful silence hung over the Miller household. Leo was subdued, clinging to Sarah's side, his eyes constantly darting towards his own bedroom door, as if expecting something to emerge. Sarah and Mark spoke in hushed, urgent tones, trying to decide what to do. The rational explanations had long since evaporated. They were facing something beyond their comprehension, something that defied logic and reason. "We have to get rid of it," Mark said, his voice hard. "Whatever it is, it can't stay here. It's threatening Leo." But how did one get rid of something that lived in shadows? Something that could seemingly pass through walls and pluck birds from the sky? Sarah found herself researching online, typing frantic, desperate queries into search engines. Entity in child's room. Malevolent, imaginary friend. Shadow creature under bed. The results were a terrifying rabbit hole of paranormal forums, folklore websites, and chillingly similar anecdotal accounts. Stories of unseen presences, of children plagued by dark friends, of escalating demands and unexplained phenomena. None of them offered easy solutions. Many of them ended badly. Leo, meanwhile, had started a new, disturbing ritual. He began leaving more substantial offerings for Nibbles. Not just snacks, but scraps of meat from dinner, a piece of chicken, a sliver of roast beef, which he would carefully wrap in a napkin and slide under his bed with a whispered apology. "Nibbles is still hungry," he'd explain, his voice barely audible, his eyes downcast. "He says the birds weren't enough. The food always disappeared, and the faint, unpleasant odor in his room began to change, to deepen, taking on a more distinctly carrion-like quality. It was a smell that seemed to seep into the very walls, a constant, nauseating reminder of the unseen occupant. Leo himself was becoming paler, more listless. He complained of being tired all the time, of feeling cold even in warm rooms. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his once boundless energy seemed to be draining away, as if something were slowly, steadily feeding off his vitality. One afternoon, Sarah was in the kitchen when she heard a strange thumping sound coming from upstairs, followed by Leo's voice, tight with distress. "No, Nibbles, stop it. That's not yours." She raced up the stairs, her heart pounding. She found Leo standing in the doorway of his room, tears in his eyes, his small fist clenched. Inside his toy chest, a large wooden box where he kept his beloved collection of stuffed animals and action figures, was open. Several of his favorite toys, a well-loved teddy bear, a plush dinosaur, a superhero action figure, were lying on the floor, not just tossed aside, but damaged. The teddy bear's button I was missing. The dinosaur had a long, dark, sticky smear across its side. The action figure's arm was bent at an unnatural angle. He wanted them, Leo sobbed, pointing a trembling finger under the bed. He said he wanted to play with them, but he plays too rough. He looked at Sarah, his face a mask of misery and fear. "He's getting stronger, Mommy." Nibbles was no longer content to remain a passive recipient of offerings. It was actively taking, actively destroying. The feeling of being under siege intensified. The entity was testing its boundaries, asserting its power, and its primary target, its focus, was undeniably Leo. That night, as Sarah tucked a fretful Leo into his bed, he refused to sleep anywhere else. Terrified of what Nibbles might do if he wasn't there to appease him, he whispered, "Mommy, Nibbles showed me something else. In my dream." "What did he show you, sweetie?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle, trying to mask the fear that was coiling in her own stomach. Leo's eyes were wide, reflecting the dim light from a hallway. He showed me a room, a dark room, under the house. He said, that's where he came from. And he said, soon, he wants to take me there, to meet his family. Sarah's blood turned to ice. A room under the house. Their house had a small, unfinished crawl space, accessible through a hatch in the utility room closet, a place they rarely, if ever, went. The thought of that dark, confined space, and the implication of Nibbles having family there, was horrifying beyond words. She hugged Leo tightly, whispering that it was just a bad dream, that Nibbles couldn't take him anywhere. But as she looked at the impenetrable darkness beneath his bed, she wasn't so sure. The hunger of the thing that lived there was growing, and its desires were becoming terrifyingly clear. It didn't just want food. It wanted Leo. Chapter 4, The Bedroom Door. The dream, or vision, of the room under the house haunted Sarah. She found herself staring at the closed utility room door with a new sense of dread, imagining what horrors might lie dormant in the crawl space beneath their feet. Mark, too, was deeply disturbed by Leo's account. The idea of the entity originating from within the very foundations of their home, and its expressed desire to take Leo there, added a terrifying new dimension to their predicament. They began to discuss more drastic measures, their conversations hushed and frantic. Selling the house? It seemed extreme, but the thought of Leo being targeted by this thing was unbearable. Could they even sell a house with such a malevolent presence? Who would believe them? They felt trapped, isolated in a nightmare that was rapidly consuming their lives. The physical manifestations of Nibbles' presence were becoming more brazen. One morning, Sarah went to wake Leo for school and found him huddled at the head of his bed, his blankets pulled up to his chin, his eyes wide with terror. He was pointing a trembling finger at his bedroom door. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Look." Sarah's gaze followed his finger. Her breath caught in her throat. Etched into the painted wood of the door, on the inside, were 3 long, deep scratches. They started near the doorknob and dragged upwards, gouging through the paint and into the wood beneath. They were too deep, too jagged, to have been made by a child's fingernails or any common household object. They looked animalistic, as if something with claws had tried to claw its way out, or had been desperately trying to prevent something else from getting in. "Nibbles did it," Leo whispered, his eyes still fixed on the marks. "He was angry last night, because I wouldn't go with him." Sarah stared at the scratches, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. The implication was clear. The entity was becoming more aggressive, more physically demonstrative in its frustration. It was no longer just whispering and leaving unsettling gifts. It was capable of direct physical damage. Mark, when he saw the scratches, was furious. Not at Leo, but at the unseen tormentor. His fear was rapidly being consumed by a protective rage. "That's it," he declared, his jaw tight. "This thing is not going to terrorize my son in his own bedroom anymore." His immediate, practical solution was to reinforce the door. He installed a heavy-duty deadbolt lock, and it's not dragging Leo anywhere. Sarah watched him, her heart heavy. She appreciated his desire to protect Leo. She also worried about the psychological impact on Leo, being essentially locked into a room with the source of his terror. That night, after Leo was asleep or pretending to be, they engaged the new deadbolt. The solid clunk of the mechanism settling into place echoed in the quiet hallway, a sound that was meant to be reassuring, but somehow felt more like sealing a tomb. Sarah and Mark retreated to their own room, leaving a baby monitor on Leo's bedside table, the volume turned up high. It was an old monitor, one they'd used when Leo was an infant, capable of transmitting both audio and a grainy, black and white video feed. They hadn't used it in years, but desperation had driven Mark to dig it out of a box in the attic. They lay in bed, the small receiver glowing faintly on Sarah's nightstand, straining their ears for any sound. For the first few hours, there was nothing but the soft rhythm of Leo's breathing. Sarah found herself drifting into an uneasy, shallow sleep, her dreams filled with shadows and whispers. She was jolted awake by a sound from the monitor. a low, guttural hiss, followed by a series of sharp, frantic clicks. It wasn't Leo. Her heart leaped in her throat. She fumbled for the monitor, her hands shaking. The video feed, already grainy, was flickering erratically, distorting into bands of static. But through the interference, she could just make out Leo's small form in his bed, tossing and turning, clearly distressed. And then, from the audio, came another sound, clearer this time. A low, drawn-out moan, filled with an unearthly frustration and rage. It seemed to be coming from directly beneath Leo's bed. This was followed by a loud, violent thump, as if something heavy had been slammed against the underside of the bed. Leo cried out, a terrified, muffled sob. "Mark!" Sarah gasped, shaking him awake. "Listen, it's in there. It's angry about the door." Mark was instantly alert, his eyes wide as he listened to the chilling sounds emanating from the receiver. The hissing, the clicks, the enraged moans. It was undeniably the entity, its fury now clearly audible. The video feed on the monitor suddenly went completely black, then flashed with a blinding white static before settling on an image of pure, unadulterated noise, the screen filled with a chaotic snowstorm of interference, focused intensely around the area of Leo's bed. It was as if the very presence of the entity was disrupting the electronic signal. They raced to Leo's room, Mark fumbling with the key to unlock the deadbolt. The sound from within were escalating, a furious, frenzied scrabbling, punctuated by more violent thumps and those terrifying, guttural hisses. When Mark finally got the door open, they were met with an arctic blast of cold air and the overwhelming stench of decay. Leo was huddled against his headboard, screaming, his eyes fixed on the space beneath his bed, where the valance was visibly trembling, as if something immensely powerful were thrashing about underneath it. The floorboards themselves seemed to vibrate. "It can't get out!" Leo shrieked, pointing at the door. "Nibbles is trapped. He's so angry." The scratches on the inside of the door seemed deeper, quickly spiderwebbing outwards. Mark grabbed Leo, pulling him from the bed and into the hallway, Sarah close behind. They slammed the door shut, engaging the deadbolt again, their hearts pounding in their chests. The furious sounds from within continued for several more minutes, then slowly, gradually subsided, replaced by an unnerving, watchful silence. Leaning against the hallway wall, gasping for breath, Sarah and Mark stared at each other, their faces pale with terror. The baby monitor, which Mark had snatched from the room, was still emitting a low crackle of static, the video feed completely blank. The attempt to contain the entity had only seemed to enrage it further, to demonstrate its power more terrifyingly. The lock on the door was a pathetic defense against something that could splinter floorboards and disrupt electronic devices with its mere presence. They were no closer to a solution, and Leo was more traumatized than ever. The whispers from beneath the bed had become a furious roar, and the shifting shadow was now a caged, enraged beast, one that was rapidly running out of patience. The house no longer felt like their own. It felt like a hunting ground, and they and their son were the prey. Chapter 5, A Parent's Unease. The aftermath of that terrifying night left Sarah and Mark reeling. Leo refused to go anywhere near his room, his fear now absolute and deeply ingrained. He slept in their bed, a trembling, restless presence between them, his sleep punctuated by nightmares and sudden, fearful awakenings. The deadbolt door to his former sanctuary remained closed, a silent testament to the horror it contained. The cold that emanated from under it was a constant, chilling reminder. During the day, Sarah found herself compulsively researching. She scoured online forums, delved into obscure folklore, and read countless articles on child psychology, night terrors, and imaginary friends. She was desperate for an answer, a label, something that could explain what was happening to her family, something that could offer a path to a solution. The child psychology articles were maddeningly unhelpful. They spoke of stress, anxiety, vivid imaginations, all of which seemed woefully inadequate to explain dead birds, physical scratches, and a palpable, malevolent presence. Leo's experiences, the sheer physicality of them, deviated too far from the benign narratives of typical childhood fantasies. It was on a particularly bleak afternoon, as rain lashed against the windows, that she stumbled upon a small, obscure online forum dedicated to unexplained domestic phenomena. The posts were a mixture of what seemed like obvious hoaxes and a few genuinely unsettling accounts. One thread, titled "My Child's Friend Isn't Friendly," caught her eye. As she read through the anonymous entries, a chill crawled up her spine. The stories, though varying in detail, shared an eerie number of similarities with their own situation. A child's initial innocent descriptions of an unseen companion, the gradual shift towards something more demanding and sinister. The unexplained cold spots, the strange odors, the small, unsettling physical occurrences. One parent described finding strange, slimy residues. Another wrote about deep scratches appearing on furniture. A third recounted their child becoming withdrawn and fearful, obsessed with feeding their unseen friend. Sarah felt a strange mixture of terror and a perverse sort of validation. They weren't alone. Other people had experienced this, or something very much like it, with the children becoming increasingly affected, sometimes physically ill. There were hushed mentions of exorcisms, cleansings, paranormal investigators, all options that seemed extreme, outlandish. You were now creeping into the realm of possibility in Sarah's terrified mind. Mark, meanwhile, was struggling with his own internal battle. As an engineer, his entire worldview was built on logic, on the measurable and the explainable. The events in Leo's room, particularly what he himself had witnessed and felt, directly contradicted everything he believed. He found himself oscillating between a desperate search for a rational explanation. Faulty wiring causing the cold, some unknown pest creating the smells and slime. Leo, somehow, making the scratches himself in a state of fugue, and the horrifying, creeping acceptance that they were dealing with something truly beyond the scope of his understanding. He spent hours in his workshop in the garage, not building anything, but staring blankly at his tools, his mind replaying the events, trying to fit them into a logical framework, and failing. He re-examined the baby monitor, convinced there had to be a technical fault, but it worked perfectly when tested anywhere else in the house. It was only in proximity to Leo's room, to the thing under the bed, that it malfunctioned so spectacularly. One evening, unable to bear the oppressive silence and the constant, unspoken fear that permeated their home, Mark found himself drawn back to Leo's closed door. Leo was downstairs with Sarah, watching television, a rare moment of relative calm. The hallway was cold, the chill seeping from beneath the door like an invisible tide. He didn't try the key. He simply stood there listening. At first, there was nothing but the hum of the house, the distant murmur of the TV. Then he heard it, a faint rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It was soft, almost gentle like a heartbeat, but slower, heavier. It seemed to be coming from directly beneath the floorboards of Leo's room. He pressed his ear to the cold wood of the door, straining to hear. The thumping continued, steady, hypnotic, and then another sound joined it, a low, almost inaudible sigh, like air escaping slowly from a great bellows. It was a sound of patience, of waiting. He stayed there for several minutes, transfixed, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. This wasn't Leo. This wasn't the house settling. This was it, conscious, aware, and seemingly, for now, quiescent. As he turned to leave, his footfalls unnaturally loud in the suddenly charged silence, he glanced back at the door. And for a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, he saw it. A shadow, darker than the ambient gloom of the hallway, seemed to pool at the base of the door on the outside. It was dense, amorphous, and it seemed to subtly shift, to almost breathe. He blinked, and it was gone. Or perhaps it had never been there. Perhaps it was just a trick of the light, his fear-strained eyes playing tricks on him. But the image remained, seared into his mind, a darkness seeping out, testing the boundaries. He said nothing to Sarah about the thumping or the shadow. She was already on edge, barely sleeping, her days consumed by anxious research. He didn't want to add to her burden, but his own carefully constructed skepticism was crumbling, replaced by a gnawing, visceral dread. The thing under the bed was not just a figment of Leo's imagination, nor was it confined to that room. Its influence, its very presence, was beginning to bleed into the rest of their home. Pockets of unnatural chill had begun to appear in other parts of the house. A cold spot at the top of the stairs, a sudden icy draft in the living room even when the windows were closed. The vague, unsettling odor, too, was no longer confined to the upstairs hallway. Sometimes they would catch a faint whiff of it in the kitchen or even in their own bedroom, a fleeting, nauseating reminder of the unseen horror that shared their home. The parents' unease was rapidly transforming into a parent's terror. They were losing control, their home becoming a place of fear, their son increasingly fragile. The comforting routines of family life were being systematically dismantled, replaced by a state of constant vigilance and a desperate, unspoken question. What did it want, and how far would it go to get it? Chapter 6. The Scent of Decay. The following week, the subtle, sickly sweet odor that had clung to Leo's room underwent a horrifying transformation. It deepened, ripened, and took on the unmistakable, stomach-churning stench of active decay. It was no longer a faint, unsettling hint. It was a pervasive, gag-inducing miasma that permeated the entire upstairs of the house and was beginning to creep, like an invisible, noxious fog, into the downstairs rooms. No amount of air freshener, scented candles, or open windows could dispel it. It clung to their clothes, their hair, the very air they breathed, a constant, olfactory assault that served as an inescapable reminder of the horror lurking under Leo's bed. Leo, who was now permanently ensconced in his parents' room, began to complain that Nibbles smells really bad now. He'd wrinkle his nose and say, "He didn't used to smell like this. He used to smell like old leaves and dirt. Now he smells yucky." This pronouncement, delivered with a child's blunt honesty, only amplified Sarah and Mark's revulsion and fear. The change in scent suggested a change in the entity itself, perhaps in its nature, or in what it was consuming. Sarah, driven by a desperate need to do something, to reclaim some semblance of control, attempted a deep clean of Leo's room. Armed with the strongest cleaning supplies she could find, a face mask and rubber gloves, she unlocked the deadbolt door and stepped inside. The stench hit her like a physical blow, making her gag and her eyes water. The room was arctic, the cold emanating from under the bed with an almost painful intensity. She threw open the window, letting in a blast of crisp autumn air, but it did little to mitigate the overpowering odor. With grim determination, she began to scrub. She washed the walls, the furniture, the floor. She laundered the bedding, the curtains, even the rug, taking it outside and hosing it down with disinfectant. She paid particular attention to the area under the bed, reaching as far as she could with her mop and sponges. But no matter how much she scrubbed, the smell remained, seemingly embedded in the very fabric of the room. And the slimy residue she'd found before, it was back in several patches this time, glistening darkly on the floorboards, thicker and more viscous than before, now tinged with a faint brownish hue. The sight of it, coupled with the unbearable stench, finally broke her. She stumbled out of the room, choking back sobs, the cleaning supplies abandoned on the floor. The room was not just dirty, it felt defiled, contaminated. The disappearance of small objects from around the house also began to escalate. It started subtly, a missing pin from Mark's desk, one of Sarah's favorite earrings vanishing from her jewelry box, a particular television remote that seemed to have grown legs. At first, they dismissed these as everyday misplacements, the kind of thing that happens in any busy household. But the items never reappeared in their logical places. Instead, a few days later, Mark, his jaw tight with a grim foreboding, decided to brave Leo's room again, just to check. He shone his flashlight under the bed, his breath held against the stench, and there they were. The missing pen snapped in two, the earring bent and tarnished, lying in a patch of the sticky slime. The remote control, its casing cracked, its buttons missing, nestled amongst the now familiar detritus of dried leaves and twigs. It was as if the entity were collecting trophies, or perhaps, more chillingly, as if it were trying to incorporate pieces of their lives, their identities, into its own dark, fetid lair. Each rediscovered object was a small, personal violation, a clear message that no part of their home, no part of their lives, was truly safe from its reach. Leo, meanwhile, seemed to be fading before their eyes. His already pale complexion had taken on a grayish, almost translucent quality. His energy levels were non-existent. He spent most of his days lying listlessly on the sofa, too tired to even watch television. He ate little, complaining that everything tasted funny. The dark circles under his eyes were now deep, bruised-looking hollows. He was jumpy and anxious, starting at the slightest sound, his gaze constantly flitting towards the closed door of his parents' bedroom, as if expecting something to come through it. The doctors they consulted were baffled. Physically, they could find nothing overtly wrong with him, aside from mild dehydration and a slight vitamin deficiency. They suggested stress, anxiety, perhaps a persistent low-grade virus. But Sarah and Mark knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that Leo's decline was inextricably linked to the thing under his bed. It was as if the entity were drawing sustenance, not just from the food offerings, but from Leo himself, leeching away his vitality, his very life force. The hunger that Leo had spoken of seemed to be for something far more insidious than mere physical nourishment. It was a hunger for his essence, his spirit, and it was a hunger that seemed to be growing more voracious with each passing day. The scent of decay was no longer just a smell. It was the aroma of their son's fading light, and the terrifying bloom of an ancient, insatiable evil. Chapter 7. Whispers Beyond the Walls. The oppressive atmosphere within the house began to take a toll on Sarah's own perceptions. The constant fear, the lack of sleep, the ever-present stench of decay. It was a relentless assault on her senses and her sanity. It started subtly, like the whispers had with Leo. She'd be in the kitchen, washing dishes, and think she heard her name called, a soft, breathy whisper that seemed to come from just over her shoulder. But when she turned, no one would be there. Mark would be at work, Leo asleep in their room, or she'd be folding laundry in the living room and hear a faint, sibilant rustling, like dry leaves skittering across a wooden floor, even though all the windows were closed and there was no discernible source for the sound. At first, she dismissed it as exhaustion, her mind playing tricks on her. But the incidents became more frequent, more distinct. The whispers were no longer just indistinct murmurs. Sometimes, she could almost make out words or fragments of words, spoken in a low, guttural tone that was chillingly similar to the sounds they'd heard from the baby monitor. Sarah, it would seem to sigh, the sound like a cold breath on the back of her neck. So cold, hungry. She tried to rationalize it. The house was old. Old houses creaked and groaned. The wind could play strange tricks with sound, but the whispers felt intentional, directed. She began to doubt her own mind. Was she cracking under the strain? Was the horror of their situation causing her to hallucinate? She didn't dare mention it to Mark initially. He was already carrying so much, his own face etched with worry and sleeplessness. She didn't want to add to his burden with what might be her own descent into paranoia. But the whispers were becoming harder to ignore, seeping into the quiet moments of her day, a constant, insidious reminder of the entity's presence, its awareness of her. It was as if, with Leo now largely inaccessible to it, the thing under the bed was reaching out, trying to find a new focus, a new conduit for its malevolent influence. Leo, meanwhile, had begun to express his anxieties and his connection to Nibbles in a new, disturbing way, through his drawings. He had always loved to draw, his pictures usually vibrant and full of cheerful, imaginative scenes, superheroes, fantastical animals, spaceships exploring colorful planets. But now, His artwork had taken a dark, unsettling turn. He would sit for hours at the coffee table, a box of crayons clutched in his small hand, his tongue poking out in concentration, and fill page after page with disturbing images. The subject was always the same, Nibbles. But the Nibbles he drew was no longer the vague, shadowy figure he had initially described. It was a grotesque, nightmarish creature, long, spidery limbs ending in sharp, talon-like claws, a bloated, indistinct torso that seemed to ripple and shift, and the eyes, oversized, black, empty orbs that stared out from the page with a chilling, malevolent intelligence. Sometimes, the creature was depicted lurking in a dark, confined space, clearly meant to be the area under his bed. Other times, it was shown reaching out with those impossibly long, stick-like fingers towards a small, cowering figure that was unmistakably Leo himself. The colors he used were predominantly blacks, grays, and a sickly, brownish green that was disturbingly reminiscent of the slime they kept finding. There was no joy in these drawings, no childish whimsy. They were stark, visceral expressions of fear and a kind of morbid fascination. Sarah would find them scattered around the living room, each one a fresh stab of horror. She tried to talk to him about them. "Sweetie, can you tell Mommy about this picture?" she'd ask, her voice gentle, pointing to a particularly gruesome depiction of Nibbles with what looked like sharp teeth. Leo would just shrug, his eyes downcast. "It's Nibbles," he'd mumble. "He's hungry." Or, more chillingly, "He showed me this." In my head, the drawings became increasingly detailed, increasingly grotesque. One depicted Nibbles surrounded by small, broken animal bones. Another showed the creature with its long, shadowy tendrils wrapped around a small, house-like structure, as if crushing it. Each new drawing felt like a glimpse into the terrifying landscape of Leo's mind, a mind that was increasingly being dominated by the insidious influence of the thing he still, with a child's heartbreaking loyalty, called his friend. Mark, when he saw the drawings, felt a renewed surge of helpless rage and fear. He recognized the shapes, the descriptions Leo had given them, now rendered in stark, terrifying visual detail. It was undeniable proof of the psychological torment their son was enduring. He wanted to tear the drawings up, to burn them, to somehow erase the images from Leo's mind. But he knew it would be futile. The images weren't just on paper. They were, as Leo said, in his head, planted there by the entity. It was reaching out insidiously into their minds, their perceptions, their very sanity. The walls of their home were no longer a barrier. They were becoming porous, allowing the chilling tendrils of the entity's consciousness to seep through, to touch them, to torment them, even when they were rooms away from its dark, fetid lair. The dread was no longer just about what was under the bed. It was about what was getting inside their heads. Chapter 8. The Broken Promise. The strain was becoming unbearable. Mark, watching Leo grow weaker and more withdrawn, seeing Sarah haunted by whispers and their home saturated with an ever-present stench of decay, felt a desperate, reckless anger begin to build within him. He was a man of action, an engineer who solved problems with logic and tangible solutions. This thing defied all logic, but he couldn't stand by and do nothing as it destroyed his family. One Saturday morning, after a particularly bad night where Leo had woken screaming from a nightmare about shadows with teeth, Mark reached his breaking point. "I'm ending this," he declared, his voice tight with a grim resolve that bordered on fury. "Today, I'm clearing out that room. Everything. There will be nothing left for it to hide under, nothing for it to cling to." Sarah looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "Mark, are you sure? What if it makes it angrier?" He shook his head, his jaw set. "It can't get any angrier than it already is. And we can't live like this anymore. It's time to fight back, to reclaim our home, to reclaim our son." He threw open the door to Leo's room, the deadbolt clanging loudly as it retracted. The wave of cold and the putrid stench that washed over him were almost physically staggering, but he pushed through it, his face a mask of grim determination. He started with the bed itself. With a grunt of exertion, He dragged the mattress and box spring off the frame and out into the hallway. Then, he was creating a clear, open space, exposing the floorboards beneath to the stark light of day. As he worked, he could feel it, that palpable, malevolent presence, watching him, its silent fury radiating from the very walls. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet further, and the stench of decay intensified, as if the entity were concentrating its foulness in protest. He ignored it, his anger fueling his actions. He dragged out Leo's small desk, his toy chest, his bookshelf, piling everything in the hallway until the room was almost entirely bare, save for the lingering, oppressive atmosphere. Finally, he stood in the center of the emptied room, breathing heavily, sweat trickling down his temples despite the unnatural cold. The floorboards where the bed had been were stained with those familiar slimy patches, darker and more extensive than ever. The small crack he'd seen earlier had widened, a jagged fissure running several feet across the wood. He stared at it, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He had promised Leo, promised Sarah, promised himself, that this would be the end of it, that Nibbles would be gone. But looking at that violated space, feeling the undiminished, icy malevolence that still clung to the air, he knew, with a sickening certainty, that it wasn't gone. It was just angrier. He spent the rest of the afternoon scrubbing the floorboards with bleach until his hands were raw, trying to eradicate the slime, the smell, the very memory of the thing's presence. But it was like trying to scrub away a shadow. The room felt marginally cleaner, but the oppressive cold and the faint, underlying scent of decay remained a stubborn, chilling reminder. That night, they put Leo to bed in their room, as usual, but the atmosphere in the house was different. It was taut, stretched, like the air before a violent thunderstorm. Mark felt a grim satisfaction at having taken action, but a deeper, more primal fear was beginning to curdle it. He had, in essence, declared war on an unseen enemy, an enemy whose capabilities they were only beginning to understand. He had broken his unspoken promise to the entity, the promise of its undisturbed sanctuary, and he had a terrible feeling it would retaliate. They all went to bed with a sense of profound unease, every creak of the old house, every rustle of leaves outside the window, sounding like a potential threat. Sarah lay awake for hours, listening, her nerves raw. Mark, despite his exhaustion, found himself unable to fully relax, his senses on high alert. The retaliation came in the dead of night. It wasn't a gradual build-up, but a sudden, violent explosion of activity. They were jolted awake by a sound that shook the entire house, a deafening crash from the direction of Leo's now empty room, followed by a splintering, tearing noise. It sounded as if the room itself were being ripped apart. Mark was out of bed in an instant, his heart pounding. Sarah close behind him, her hand instinctively reaching for Leo, who was already sitting bolt upright, his eyes wide with terror. "It's Nibbles," he shrieked. "He's really, really angry now. You took his bed." The heavy oak dresser that had stood against the far wall of Leo's room. A solid, antique piece of furniture that took two strong men to move, toppled over with immense force, hitting the floor with a sound like a thunderclap. The floorboards beneath their feet vibrated from the impact. Sarah screamed, clutching Leo tightly. Mark stared in disbelief and horror. The strength required to topple that dresser was enormous, far beyond anything human. Whatever was in that room possessed a terrifying, raw power. The roaring continued, accompanied by the sounds of splintering wood and shattering objects, as if the entity were systematically destroying everything within its reach, venting its rage on the now empty space. "He says he wants his home back," Leo whimpered, his small body trembling uncontrollably. "He says he'll make a new one, a bigger one." The thought of what that meant, of the entity somehow expanding its territory, its physical manifestation, was horrifying. They stood frozen in the hallway, listening to the rampage, helpless. There was nothing they could do but wait for it to end. After what seemed like an eternity, the sounds of destruction began to subside. replaced by a series underscore low, angry growls, then finally, an exhausted, seething silence. The cold emanating from Leo's room was more intense than ever, a palpable wave of icy malice. Mark, his face pale and drawn, slowly approached the door, his hand hovering over the deadbolt. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that what he would find on the other side would be far worse than anything they had yet witnessed. The broken promise had unleashed a new level of terror, and the thing under the bed was making it terrifyingly clear that it would not be so easily evicted. It was fighting back, and it was stronger than they could have ever imagined. Chapter 9. Seeking Answers. The scene inside Leo's room the next morning was one of utter devastation. The heavy oak dresser lay shattered on the floor, its drawers splintered, its mirror cracked into a spiderweb of jagged shards. What little furniture Mark hadn't removed had been similarly demolished. A small wooden chair was in pieces, bookshelves torn from the walls, their contents strewn across the floor. The walls themselves bore new, deeper gouges, as if raked by enormous claws. The air was thick with the stench of decay and a new, acrid smell, like ozone or burnt electricity. And the floorboards, the crack where the bed had once stood, was now a gaping, jagged hole, several feet long and almost a foot wide, revealing the dark, earthy abyss of the crawl space beneath. It was as if the entity, in its fury, had literally torn open the floor to create a more direct connection to what Leo had called its old home. Sarah surveyed the wreckage, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. This was no longer just an unseen presence. It was a destructive, violent force, one that was actively, physically, trying to reshape their home to its liking. Desperate and terrified, Sarah decided she could no longer rely on her own research or Mark's increasingly futile attempts at practical solutions. They needed outside help, professional help. Though what kind of professional could deal with something like this, she had no idea. Her first instinct was to try a child psychologist again. Perhaps, she reasoned, whose office was in a neighboring town. She managed to get an emergency appointment, pouring out their story in a frantic, tearful torrent over the phone to a skeptical but patient receptionist. Dr. Vance listened intently as Sarah, accompanied by a hollow-eyed Mark and a silent, withdrawn Leo, recounted the escalating horror of the past few weeks. She was a kind, empathetic woman in her late 50s with a calm, reassuring demeanor. She asked gentle questions, observed Leo's anxious fidgeting and his reluctance to make eye contact, and took copious notes. She spoke of anxiety disorders, of vivid imaginations manifesting under stress, of folie à deux, where family members can inadvertently reinforce each other's delusional beliefs. She suggested play therapy for Leo, family counseling sessions, perhaps even a mild sedative to help him sleep. But as Sarah began to describe the physical phenomena, the dead birds, the scratches, the slime, the toppled dresser, the gaping hole in the floor, Dr. Vance's calm expression began to waver. A flicker of something unreadable, disbelief, concern, crossed her face. She asked to see photos, and Mark, who had grimly documented the destruction in Leo's room with his phone, showed them to her. Dr. Vance stared at the images of the clawed door, the shattered dresser, the jagged hole in the floorboards, her professional composure visibly strained. This is beyond the scope of typical childhood night terrors, Mr. and Mrs. Miller, she said slowly, her voice losing some of its earlier assurance. The level of physical destruction is highly unusual. She admitted, with a candor that Sarah appreciated, that while she could offer support for Leo's psychological distress, she felt ill-equipped to address the root cause if it was indeed something paranormal. She didn't use that word, but the implication was clear. She gave them some referrals for therapists specializing in extreme stress in children, but also, almost hesitantly, suggested they might consider other avenues of investigation if they felt all rational explanations had been exhausted. It was a tacit admission that she was out of her depth, and it left Sarah feeling more hopeless than ever. Mark, meanwhile, had begun his own line of research, one that diverged sharply from Sarah's focus on psychology. His engineering mind, while still struggling to accept the supernatural, was now forced to consider possibilities outside the realm of conventional science. He started looking into local history, spending hours at the town library, poring over dusty archives and old newspaper clippings. He searched for information about their house, their street, the land itself. He was looking for patterns, for any past events that might shed light on their current nightmare. He found records of the original landowners, of the various families who had lived in their house over the decades. Most of it was mundane: births, deaths, property transfers. But then, tucked away in a brittle, leather-bound volume of local folklore and anecdotal histories, he found something that made his blood run cold. It was a brief, almost overlooked entry dating back to the late 19th century. It spoke of a family named Blackwood who had once owned a large tract of land that included the area where their street now stood. The Blackwoods were rumored to have been reclusive and eccentric, involved in unwholesome practices and communing with things best left undisturbed. The entry mentioned whispers of strange rituals conducted on their property, of livestock disappearing or being found mutilated, and, most chillingly, of a child from a neighboring farm who had vanished without a trace, last seen playing near the Blackwood property line. There were no official records of any wrongdoing, just local gossip and fearful speculation. But the entry ended with a cryptic, handwritten note in the margin, added by a later librarian. Some say the Blackwoods never truly left, that their influence lingers in the soil, waiting. Mark stared at the words, a sickening sense of dread dawning within him. The room under the house that Leo had spoken of, the entity's connection to the earth, to the darkness beneath. Could it be possible that their home was built on land tainted by some long-forgotten evil, an evil that was now reawakening, drawn to the vulnerability of their son? The parallels were too disturbing to ignore. He photocopied the page, his hand trembling, the folkloric account feeling far more relevant, far more terrifyingly plausible than any psychological diagnosis. The answers they were seeking, it seemed, were not to be found in modern medicine or rational thought, but in the shadowed, half-forgotten history of the very ground beneath their feet. And those answers pointed towards a horror far older and far more deeply rooted than they had ever dared to imagine. Chapter 10. The Thing Takes Shape. The discovery of the Blackwood legend cast a pall of deeper, more ancient dread over the Miller household. Mark shared his findings with Sarah, his voice low and grave. The notion that their home might be built on land tainted by occult practices and a history of malevolence resonated chillingly with Leo's descriptions of Nibbles' old home being under the house. It suggested that the entity wasn't just a random manifestation, but something tied to the location itself, something that might have lain dormant for generations, waiting for the right conditions, or the right vulnerable soul to awaken it. The gaping hole in Leo's bedroom floor now seemed less like random destruction and more like a deliberate act of unearthing. They sealed off Leo's room completely, barricading the door with a heavy bookcase in addition to the deadbolt. The sound from within had largely ceased after the night of the rampage, replaced by an unnerving, watchful silence that was almost worse. The stench of decay, however, remained a constant, cloying presence that seemed to mock their attempts to contain the evil. But the entity, it soon became clear, was not content to remain confined. Its influence, its very essence, began to seep out, to manifest in more overt and terrifying ways throughout the rest of the house. It started with the lights. Bulbs would flicker and die with alarming frequency, often in rooms where Sarah or Mark were present. Sometimes entire circuits would inexplicably trip, plunging sections of the house into sudden, unnerving darkness. Mark, the engineer, checked the wiring repeatedly, finding nothing wrong. The power surges seemed to have no logical cause. They were erratic, localized, and often accompanied by a sharp drop in temperature and a fleeting whiff of that familiar, rotten odor. Doors, too, began to act erratically. Interior doors that were firmly closed would be found ajar, or sometimes wide open. The heavy front door, always locked, would occasionally creak open a few inches on its own, as if inviting something in or letting something out. More disturbingly, they would sometimes hear doors slamming shut with violent force in unoccupied rooms, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. The cold spots were no longer fleeting or localized. The entire house seemed to be growing colder, a damp, bone-chilling cold that no amount of turning up the thermostat could dispel. It was as if the natural warmth of their home was being leached away, replaced by the unnatural chill of the entity's presence. And the whispers, Sarah was no longer the only one hearing them. Mark, too, began to catch faint, sibilant murmurs at the edge of his hearing, especially when he was alone or when the house was quiet in the dead of night. They were still indistinct, but they carried an undeniable undercurrent of malice, of a hungry, patient intelligence. One evening, as Sarah was preparing dinner in the kitchen, with Leo listlessly watching cartoons in the adjoining family room, a section of the kitchen plaster, near the ceiling, suddenly cracked and bulged outwards, as if something were pushing from within the wall. A fine shower of dust and plaster rained down onto the countertops. Sarah cried out, backing away, her heart pounding. Mark rushed in. They stared at the bulging plaster, which seemed to almost pulse, like something breathing behind it. A faint, dark stain began to spread across the bulge. A viscous, oily seepage that carried the now overpowering stench of decay. It was as if the very walls of their house were becoming corrupted, infected by the entity's spreading malignancy. The thing was no longer just under the bed, or even just in Leo's room. It was becoming part of the house itself. The true, horrifying extent of this became clear during a particularly violent thunderstorm a few nights later. The power had gone out, plunging the house into an inky blackness, punctuated only by the brilliant, terrifying flashes of lightning. Leo was hysterical, clinging to Sarah. Mark was fumbling for flashlights when a deafening crack of thunder directly overhead seemed to shake the house to its foundations. In the prolonged, actinic glare of the subsequent lightning flash, they saw it, for a horrifying, frozen moment, standing in the archway between the living room and the dining room, where only seconds before there had been empty space, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, and composed of what seemed like writhing, coalesced shadows. It had no discernible features, no face, just a vaguely humanoid shape that seemed to absorb the light around it, making it appear even darker than the surrounding gloom. Long, stick-like tendrils, reminiscent of Leo's drawings, extended from its torso, twitching and writhing like Medusa's snakes. And from the area where a head should have been, 2 points of faint, malevolent red light glowed like hot coals. The image was burned into their retinas in that split second of illumination. Then, darkness slammed back in, leaving only the lingering, terrifying afterimage. Sarah screamed, a raw, primal sound of utter terror. Mark, his voice choked, managed to get a flashlight on, its beam cutting a shaky path through the darkness. The archway was empty. There was nothing there but the oppressive darkness and the lingering, intensified stench of decay now mixed with the sharp, metallic scent of ozone from the lightning. But they had both seen it. It wasn't just a feeling anymore, not just whispers or smells or cold spots. It was a shape, a form, the thing under the bed, the thing in the walls, the thing from the tainted earth beneath their home, had taken shape. It was no longer just an influence. It was a tangible, visible entity, and it was stalking the corridors of their home, no longer content to remain hidden in the shadows. The true nightmare had finally, fully revealed itself, and it was far more terrifying than they could ever have imagined. Chapter 11. The House That Bleeds. The fleeting, terrifying glimpse of the shadowy figure during the thunderstorm marked a horrifying turning point. The entity was no longer content with subtle manifestations. It was asserting its presence with a horrifying, visceral physicality. The house itself seemed to be succumbing to its corrupting influence, becoming a living extension of its malevolence. The first sign was the dark, viscous liquid. It began to seep, slowly at first. From a gaping hole in Leo's bedroom floor, a thick, tar-like substance that oozed out onto the surrounding wood, carrying that unbearable stench of profound decay, now mingled with the coppery. Black puddles would form in corners, seemingly appearing from nowhere, always accompanied by that signature, soul-chilling cold and the pervasive, sickening odor. Sarah and Mark tried to clean it, and it stained everything it came into contact with a deep, indelible blackish brown. The house was becoming a canvas for the entity's grotesque artwork, each new seepage a fresh mark of its dominion. Leo, witnessing these horrifying manifestations, became even more withdrawn, his small face a mask of perpetual fear. He refused to be left alone, even for a moment, clinging to Sarah or Mark with a desperate, trembling grip. He spoke less and less, and when he did, his voice was weak, his words often confused or nonsensical. He seemed to be fading, his vitality dimming like a guttering candle. His skin had a sickly, almost gray pallor, and his eyes, once bright and inquisitive, were now dull and haunted, reflecting the encroaching darkness that was consuming their home and their lives. One evening, as Sarah was trying to coax him to eat a few spoonfuls of soup, he looked up at her, his eyes wide with a chilling, vacant clarity. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice a dry rustle. "Nibbles says he's almost ready. He says he wants to be part of the family. Forever." Sarah's blood ran cold. The words, spoken in Leo's frail, childlike voice, carried an unbearable weight of menace. It was no longer about just being his friend. The entity's intentions were becoming terrifyingly clear. It wanted to integrate, to merge, to possess. The thought of what that might entail, of her son being subsumed by this ancient, malevolent consciousness, was a horror beyond imagining. She pulled him close, her body trembling, whispering reassurances she didn't believe, her heart shattering into a million pieces. The house, their home, was no longer a sanctuary. It was a tomb in the making, and the entity was slowly, inexorably, drawing them all into its cold, decaying embrace. The walls were literally bleeding, and it felt as if their hope, their sanity, their very lives were bleeding out along with it. The physical toll on Leo was becoming alarming. He was losing weight rapidly, his small frame becoming almost skeletal. He slept fitfully, his nights filled with whimpers and terrified cries, though he could rarely articulate what he had dreamed. He developed a persistent, dry cough, and his breathing often seemed shallow and labored. The doctors were still mystified, suggesting rare autoimmune disorders, environmental toxins. Anything but the supernatural truth that Sarah and Mark knew was the cause. They felt utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare that no one else could see or understand. The house itself seemed to be groaning under the weight of the entity's presence. Strange sounds emanated from the walls, creaks, groans, and sometimes a soft, rhythmic pulsing like a giant, diseased heart beating within the structure. The air was always cold, the stench of decay a constant companion. The dark seepages continued to spread, staining the walls, the floors, even beginning to drip from the ceilings in places, as if the house were slowly, inexorably, dissolving into a putrid, nightmarish morass. It was a house that was actively dying, or rather, being actively consumed, and it felt as if it were trying to drag them down with it. The unveiling was no longer just about seeing the entity. It was about witnessing the horrifying transformation of their home into a living monument to its evil, a place where the boundaries between the physical world and some ancient, rotting hellscape were becoming terrifyingly, irrevocably blurred. Chapter 12, Desperate Measures. The sight of Leo, frail and fading, his small body seemingly being consumed from within, and the horrifying transformation of their home into a bleeding, decaying shell finally pushed Sarah and Mark beyond the limits of their endurance. The rational world had failed them. Doctors, psychologists, their own attempts to fight back, all had proven useless against the insidious, encroaching evil. There was only one avenue left, one they had previously dismissed as too extreme, too outlandish. The results were a mixed bag of amateur, ghost hunting groups and individuals claiming varying degrees of expertise. She spent hours vetting them, looking for any semblance of professionalism or credibility, her desperation warring with her ingrained skepticism. Finally, she found a group that seemed more legitimate than most. Veritas Paranormal Solution. Their website was understated. Their testimonials, though anonymous, spoke of tangible results in severe cases. They listed experience with malevolent entities and deeply rooted infestations. With a nod of fear and a sliver of desperate hope in her stomach, Sarah made the call. A calm, professional-sounding woman named Althea Grayson answered. Sarah, her voice cracking with emotion, poured out their story. The imaginary friend, the escalating demands, the physical manifestations, the decline in Leo's health, the horrifying state of their home. Althea listened patiently, without interruption, her silence somehow more reassuring than a flood of platitudes would have been. When Sarah finally finished, her voice raw, Althea's response was immediate and serious. Mrs. Miller, she said, her tone grave, what you're describing is characteristic of a significant and likely deeply entrenched negative entity. We can help. We can be there within 24 hours. True to her word, Althea Grayson and her team of 2 arrived the following afternoon. Althea was a woman in her late 60s, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes sharp and intelligent, radiating an aura of calm authority. Her team consisted of a younger man named Ben, quiet and observant, who seemed to be the technical expert, laden with cases of electronic equipment, and a stoic, powerfully built man named Marcus, made them feel less alone in their terror. As Althea stepped into the house, her expression, initially composed, visibly tightened. She paused in the hallway, her gaze sweeping the stained walls, her nostrils flaring slightly as she took in the pervasive stench of decay. The energy here is heavy, she said softly, more to herself than to them, and deeply negative. The team spent several hours conducting their initial investigation. Ben set up various pieces of equipment throughout the house: electromagnetic field, EMF, detectors, thermal cameras, audio recorders sensitive to infrasound. Marcus walked through each room, his expression unreadable, occasionally stopping to run a hand along a wall or stare intently into a shadowed corner. Althea focused her attention on Leo, speaking to him gently, her voice calm and soothing. Leo, who had been almost catatonic with fear around strangers, seemed to respond to her, his gaze less vacant, a flicker of awareness in his eyes as she spoke to him about bad dreams and scary shadows. She then asked to see Leo's room. Mark, his face grim, unlocked the barricaded door. The wave of cold and the intensified stench that rolled out were even worse than before. Althea stepped inside, her composure unwavering, though her eyes narrowed as she took in the devastation. The gaping hole in the floor, the dark, viscous liquid still slowly oozing from it. This is its nexus, she said, her voice low. Its anchor point. After their initial sweep, the team convened with Sarah and Mark in the living room, the only space that felt marginally less oppressive. What you have here, Althea began, her gaze direct and serious, is a powerful, deeply rooted entity. It's likely preternatural, possibly demonic in origin, or at the very least, an ancient parasitic consciousness tied to this land, as your research suggested, Mr. Miller. It has fixated on Leo, drawing sustenance from his life force, his fear, the physical manifestations, the alteration of the house itself. These are signs of its increasing power and its intention to fully claim this space. and your son as its own. The words, though terrifying, were also a strange kind of relief. Finally, someone was acknowledging the reality of their nightmare, giving it a name, however dreadful. Can you get rid of it? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Althea's expression was grave. We could try, she said, but it will not be easy. It is deeply entrenched, and it will fight. What is required is a full spiritual cleansing, a ritual of banishment. It will be arduous and potentially dangerous. The entity will resist, and it will likely focus its rage on Leo and on anyone attempting to sever its connection. She looked at them, her eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and grim resolve. We need your full cooperation and your strength. This will be a battle for your son's soul and for your home. The desperate measures had led them to this. A paranormal investigation team, talk of demonic entities and rituals of banishment. It was a reality far removed from the ordinary life they had once known, but it was now their only hope. The fight for Leo and for their very survival was about to enter a new, terrifying phase. Chapter 13, The Source Revealed. With the decision made to proceed with the ritual of banishment, Althea and her team began their preparations, transforming the Millers' blighted home into a potential spiritual battleground. Ben and Marcus worked with quiet efficiency, their movements precise and purposeful. They brought in more equipment, protective symbols, vials of consecrated oils and holy water, bags of salt, and various herbs known in folklore for their apotropaic properties. Althea, meanwhile, dedicated practitioners of a particularly dark and ancient form of elemental worship, one that involved blood sacrifice and the intentional summoning of chthonic entities, beings of the deep earth, often parasitic and malevolent. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The folklore about the missing child from the neighboring farm. It's more than just a rumor. We've found corroborating, albeit veiled, references in other historical accounts. It seems highly probable that a child sacrifice did indeed occur on this land, generations ago, likely intended to bind such an entity to the property, to serve the Blackwood's purposes, or perhaps to appease it. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The thought was sickening, almost unbearable. And this entity, Althea continued, her gaze unwavering. The one you call Nibbles, it is almost certainly the same one the Blackwood summoned, or a direct consequence of their actions. It has lain dormant, or perhaps tethered, for a long time, feeding on the residual energies of this place. Leo's sensitivity, his youthful vulnerability, his inherent life force. It likely acted as a beacon, drawing the entity out, offering a new, potent source of sustenance and a means to grow stronger, to manifest more fully. The source of her nightmare was no longer an abstract evil. It had a history, a lineage of darkness. The entity wasn't just a random horror. It was an ancient predator, awakened from a long slumber, its hunger rekindled by their innocent son. Althea explained that the entity's connection to the land, and specifically to the crawl space beneath Leo's room, the room under the house, was crucial. That was its heart, its anchor to this plane of existence. The ritual of banishment would need to focus on severing that connection, on cleansing the land itself, as well as protecting Leo. The preparations became more intense. Ben and Marcus outlined the perimeter of the house with a thick line of blessed salt. They painted protective sigils on the doors and windows, using a mixture of consecrated oil and powdered iron. The air in the house grew thick with the scent of sage and other pungent herbs as they burned them in small braziers. The smoke intended to purify and repel negative energies. Lao, despite his weakness, seemed to respond to Althea's calm presence. She spent time with him, teaching him simple protective visualizations, encouraging him to focus on light and love. Small spiritual weapons against the encroaching darkness. As the day wore on and the preparations for the nighttime ritual continued, the entity seemed to sense the shift, the organized resistance. The house grew colder, the pockets of icy air more frequent and intense. The dark seepages on the walls seemed to weep more profusely, the stench of decay becoming almost suffocating. Strange noises echoed through the house. Guttural growls from empty rooms, sharp, angry rapping sounds on the walls, and once a blood-curdling, multi-toned shriek that seemed to come from the very foundations of the house, a sound that made even the stoic Marcus flinch. The lights flickered and died with increasing regularity. As evening approached and the team was making their final arrangements in and around Leo's former bedroom, the entity chose to make its presence undeniably, terrifyingly known. The temperature in the hallway outside Leo's room plummeted to near freezing. The remaining lights in that section of the house exploded in a shower of sparks. And from within the sealed room, a sound began to build, a low, guttural humming, like a million angry hornets that vibrated through the floorboards, through their very bones. The barricaded door began to rattle violently in its frame, the heavy bookcase scraping against the floor as if pushed by an immense, unseen force. Suddenly, the door burst open, the deadbolt sheared clean off, the bookcase toppling with a crash, its contents scattering. And in the doorway, framed against the Stygian blackness of the ruined room, the entity fully manifested. It was larger now, taller than a man, its shadowy form more defined, yet still shifting, roiling like a column of living darkness. The vaguely humanoid shape was there, but it was distorted, elongated, its limbs too long, its torso too thin, as if stretched on some invisible rack. The tendrils, thicker and more numerous now, whipped and writhed around it, crackling with a faint, sickly green energy. And the eyes, those 2 points of malevolent red light, burned with an intensity that was physically painful to look at, radiating pure, unadulterated hatred and a terrifying, ancient hunger. It let out a sound that was not a shriek or a roar, but a deep, resonant wave of pure malice that washed over them, chilling them to the core, filling their minds with images of decay, despair, and unending, agonizing torment. Mine. A voice seemed to echo directly in their heads, a composite of 1,000 whispering, rasping voices, cold and devoid of any human inflection. He is mine. This house mine. It took a step forward, one of its shadowy tendrils lashing out, leaving a deep, smoking gouge in the hallway wall. Sarah screamed, stumbling back, Mark pulling her behind him. Althea stood her ground, her face pale but resolute, clutching a silver crucifix. Ben and Marcus moved to flank her, their expressions grim. Their own protective talismans held ready. The source of their horror was no longer a mystery. It was here, it was revealed, and it was ready to fight for what it considered its property. The battle for Leo's soul and for their lives had truly begun. Chapter 14. The Ritual of Banishment. The air crackled with an unholy energy, the stench of decay and ozone thick and cloying. The entity, a towering column of writhing shadow and malevolent red light, advanced slowly down the hallway, its tendrils lashing out, gouging chunks of plaster from the walls, its very presence seeming to warp the reality around it. "Protect Leo," Althea commanded, her voice sharp and clear above the cacophony of guttural growls and whispers that emanated from the creature. Marcus, moving with surprising speed for his size, positioned himself between the advancing entity and the doorway to the master bedroom where Leo lay, a human shield. Ben began to chant loudly in Latin, his voice surprisingly strong and steady, its shadowy form flickering. Althea, clutching her crucifix, stepped forward to meet the entity's advance. "By the power of all that is sacred and holy," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction, "I command you, unclean spirit, to depart from this place. You have no dominion here. This child is not yours. This house is not yours." The entity let out a deafening, multi-toned shriek of rage, and a wave of icy, psychic pressure slammed into them, making Sarah stagger and cry out. her mind filled with fleeting images of rot and despair. Mark, his arm around her, felt a surge of cold dread, but he held firm, his gaze fixed on Althea. The crucifix in Althea's hand began to glow with a faint, silvery light. She thrust it towards the creature. "Return to the abyss from whence you came," she cried. "Be gone." Where the light of the crucifix touched the entity's shadowy form, it seemed to sizzle and retract, as if burned. The creature hissed, a sound like superheated steam escaping a ruptured pipe, and one of its tendrils lashed out with blinding speed towards Althea. Marcus intercepted it with a heavy, silver-banded wooden staff he produced from his bag, the impact echoing like a gunshot. The tendril recoiled, smoking. The Nexus room, Althea shouted to Ben, indicating Leo's devastated former bedroom. "We must sever its anchor." This was the heart of the ritual. While Althea and Marcus held the entity at bay in the hallway, Ben, protected by his chanting and a circle of salt he quickly poured around himself, had to enter the defiled room and perform the cleansing rites at the gaping hole in the floor, the entity's direct conduit to the tainted earth beneath. It was a terrifyingly dangerous task. Ben, his face pale but determined, ducked under Marcus's guard and sprinted into the ruined room. The entity shrieked again, its fury intensifying as it sensed its connection being threatened. It redoubled its assault on Althea and Marcus, its shadowy form lunging, its tendrils whipping, the very air around them growing colder, heavier, as if the house itself were trying to crush them. Inside Leo's room, Ben worked frantically. He poured a circle of consecrated salt around the jagged hole in the floor, then doused the area with holy water, which steamed and sizzled as it touched the corrupted wood and the dark, oozing earth beneath. He began a powerful incantation of severance, his voice rising in a desperate crescendo, pleading for divine intervention to break the unholy chains that bound the entity to this place. The room itself seemed to come alive in protest. The remaining walls buckled and groaned. Objects, splintered wood, broken toys, shards of plaster, flew through the air as if hurled by an invisible poltergeist. The stench of decay was overwhelming, and a low, guttural moaning seemed to rise from the very ground beneath his feet. In the hallway, the battle raged. The entity, enraged by the assault on its nexus, was becoming more powerful, more desperate. It slammed its shadowy bulk against Marcus, sending him staggering back, his staff cracking under the strain. Althea, though clearly tiring, continued her prayers, her voice unwavering, her heart tearing. "It's drawing on him." Althea glanced back, her face grim. "It's trying to maintain its hold. Ben, now, sever it." From Leo's room came a sudden, blinding flash of white light, followed by a sound like 1,000 breaking chains. Ben's voice rose in a final, triumphant shout of a sacred name. The entity in the hallway let out a soul-shattering, agonized shriek, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. Its shadowy form convulsed violently, flickering and distorting. The red light in its eyes flared, then began to dim. Its tendrils thrashed wildly, then went limp, beginning to dissolve into wisps of black smoke. The oppressive cold in the hallway lessened, the psychic pressure receding. The house itself seemed to let out a long, shuddering sigh. With a final, despairing wail that faded into an echo, the entity's form imploded, collapsing in on itself, the darkness dissipating like mist in the morning sun, leaving behind only the lingering stench of ozone and a profound, echoing silence. Ben emerged from Leo's room, pale and shaking, but triumphant. "It's done," he gasped. "The connection is broken. It's banished." Althea, leaning heavily on her crucifix, nodded, her face etched with exhaustion, but also a profound relief. Marcus, though bruised and battered, managed a weary smile. Sarah and Mark rushed to Leo's side. He was still crying, but his breathing was easier, the frantic terror in his eyes slowly receding, replaced by a dazed confusion. The oppressive, malevolent presence that had choked their home for so long was gone. The air felt lighter, cleaner, the unnatural chill dissipating. The ritual of banishment, a desperate gamble in a terrifying spiritual war, had succeeded. But as Althea looked at the exhausted parents and the traumatized child, she knew the ordeal was not entirely over. The scars, both physical and spiritual, would remain. And the question of what price had truly been paid for their victory still hung, unspoken, in the suddenly quiet air. Chapter 15. The Silence Under the Bed. The silence that descended upon the Miller house in the aftermath of the banishment was profound, almost unnervingly complete. After weeks, months, of living with constant oppressive cold, inexplicable noises, and the pervasive stench of decay, the sudden absence of these malevolent signatures was both a monumental relief and subtly disorienting. The air, while still carrying a faint, lingering scent of burnt sage and ozone from the ritual, felt breathable again, lighter. The unnatural chill had dissipated, replaced by the normal, ambient temperature of an autumn night. Althea Grayson and her team, though clearly exhausted, conducted a final sweep of the house. Ben's instruments, which had previously shrieked and crackled with chaotic energy readings, were now quiet, registering only normal background levels. The dark, viscous seepages on the walls and floors had stopped spreading. In fact, they seemed to be slowly, almost imperceptibly, receding, drying out, leaving behind faint, ugly stains like old scars. Lao, cradled in Sarah's arms, had fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep, the first truly restful sleep he'd had in what felt like an eternity. The gray, haunted pallor was already beginning to recede from his small face, replaced by a touch of natural color. His breathing was even and untroubled. Seeing him like this, so profoundly at peace, brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes. Tears not of terror this time, but of overwhelming gratitude and a fragile, nascent hope. Althea, observing him, nodded with a gentle smile. "He's free," she said softly. "The entity's hold on him is broken. He will need time to heal, both physically and emotionally, but the core infection, the spiritual parasite, has been removed." She explained that while the primary entity was banished, the house itself would require a period of cleansing and healing. Generations of negative energy, culminating in this recent infestation, have left their mark, she said. "We've performed the major surgery, so to speak. Now comes the recovery." She left them with detailed instructions for continued spiritual hygiene, regular smudging with sage, prayers, maintaining a positive and loving atmosphere. She also recommended they repair the physical damage to the house as soon as possible, particularly the hole in Leo's bedroom floor, sealing it properly to prevent any residual energies from seeping back. Before leaving, as dawn was painting the sky in pale hues of gray and pink, Althea spoke to Sarah and Mark privately. The ritual required a significant output of focused, positive spiritual energy to counteract the entity's deep-rooted malevolence, she explained, her gaze serious. Your love for Leo, your combined will for him to be free, was a crucial component. In essence, a sacrifice of will, of emotional energy, was made by all of us, but especially by you, his parents. You poured your own life force, your hope, into that battle. She paused. There might be echoes, lingering sensitivities. Sometimes, after such an ordeal, a space can retain a certain memory. It's unlikely the entity can return in its previous strength, not without a new invitation or a significant weakening of the spiritual defenses. But vigilance is key. Her words were a reminder that while the war might be over, they would need to remain mindful of the peace. In the weeks and months that followed, Cheerful Yellow, Leo, though initially hesitant, eventually reclaimed his space, though his old bed remained dismantled in the attic. He chose a new one, a simple, modern design with no space underneath for shadows to gather. He slowly regained his strength and vitality. The dark circles under his eyes faded, his appetite returned. and the bright spark of his inquisitive, playful nature began to reemerge. He still had occasional nightmares, vague and shadowy, but they grew less frequent, less terrifying. He rarely spoke of Nibbles, and when he did, it was with a child's distant, almost matter-of-fact recollection of a bad dream he'd once had. The drawings of grotesque creatures were replaced by pictures of suns, rainbows, and happy, smiling stick figures. The house, too, seemed to heal. The oppressive atmosphere lifted completely. The strange smells vanished. The unexplained noises ceased. It once again became a place of warmth, of family, of ordinary, everyday life. Yet, Sarah and Mark never forgot. The memory of the terror, of the entity's malevolent presence, was seared into their souls. They remained vigilant, following Althea's advice, maintaining a home filled with light and love. Their gratitude for their son's recovery a constant, unspoken prayer. Life moved on. Years passed. Leo grew into a healthy, well-adjusted teenager, then a young man. The terrifying events of his early childhood a distant, almost unbelievable memory. Sarah and Mark watched him thrive, their hearts filled with a quiet, profound thankfulness. The house remained their home, peaceful and unremarkable. But sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and still, Sarah would find herself standing in the hallway outside Leo's old room. The air would be still, the temperature normal. And yet, sometimes if she listened very, very intently, she thought she could hear it. A sound so faint it was almost beneath the threshold of hearing. A dry, rustling whisper, like leaves skittering across a distant, forgotten floor. Or perhaps it was just the old house settling. Perhaps it was just the echo of a fear too deep to ever truly be erased. She would never know for sure, and she would never, ever look under the bed. The silence under the bed was, for the most part, complete. But in the deepest, quietest corners of the night, the question always lingered. Was Nibbles truly, irrevocably gone? Or was he merely dormant, a whisper in the silence, patiently waiting? Thank you for joining me on this unsettling journey into the shadows. If the thing under the bed sent a chill down your spine, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your own spooky experiences, and subscribing to the Eli Nightfall channel for more tales of terror. Your support helps me continue to bring these nightmares to life. Until next time, sleep well, if you can. And maybe, just maybe, keep a night light on. Good evening. Or perhaps, given the nature of our journey tonight, good isn't quite the right word. Let's settle for welcome. I am Eli Nightfall, and it's a distinct pleasure to have your company once more as we prepare to part the veil between the world you know and the unsettling realms that pulse just beneath its skin. Tonight, we explore a fear that is both primal and deeply personal, one that often takes root in the most sacred of spaces, the childhood bedroom. It's a place of whispered secrets, of burgeoning dreams, and sometimes of things that whisper back from the shadows. Our story is called The Thing Under the Bed. Slight pause. The crackling fire is the only sound. The whispers started subtly, like the rustle of dry leaves skittering across an attic floor, or the almost inaudible sigh of a house settling in the deep quiet of night. For 7-year-old Leo Miller, they were the first intimations of a new friendship, a secret world that blossomed in the shadowy expanse beneath his race-car-themed bed. He called his new friend Nibbles. It was a comforting name. Sarah thought, when Leo first mentioned him, something small and perhaps a little timid. The kind of companion a boy on the cusp of shedding his toddlerhood for the more serious business of second grade might conjure. Mark, ever the pragmatist, had ruffled Leo's sandy hair and chuckled. Making friends already, buddy? That's my boy. Their house, a 2-story colonial with a welcoming, if slightly faded, yellow clapboard exterior, sat on a quiet, tree-lined street in a suburb that prided itself on its ordinariness. It was the kind of place where an imaginary friend felt like a perfectly normal milestone, a harmless flourish of a developing mind. Leo was a bright, inquisitive child prone to elaborate stories and grand pronouncements. his imagination a vibrant landscape Sarah and Mark encouraged. So, Nibbles was welcomed into the family lore with the same gentle indulgence they'd shown to Captain Astro, Leo's previous astronaut-themed alter ego. Nibbles says hello, Leo would announce at the breakfast table, his mouth full of cereal, eyes wide and earnest. Oh, does he? Sarah would reply, pouring coffee. Well, tell Nibbles hello from us. He says you have nice hair, Mommy. That's very kind of him. The early days of Nibbles were filled with such innocuous exchanges. Leo would spend hours in his room, ostensibly playing with his building blocks or action figures, but a low murmur of conversation, Leo's voice, and then expectant pauses would drift down the hallway. He'd report Nibbles' preferences. He didn't like broccoli, but loved strawberries, just like Leo. His opinions, cartoons were fun, but loud noises were scary. And his nightly activities, Nibbles, apparently never slept but kept watch. It was during one of these nightly watchings that the first ripple of unease disturbed the placid surface of Sarah's maternal calm. Leo had been tucked in. Story read, kisses exchanged. The house was sinking into its nocturnal rhythm. The hum of the refrigerator, a familiar drone. Sarah was downstairs, finishing up some emails when a small sound, a distinct thump, echoed from Leo's room. Not loud enough to be a fall, but definite. She paused, listened. Silence. Then, another thump, softer this time, followed by Leo's giggle. She found him sitting up in bed, a wide grin on his face, his eyes sparkling in the dim glow of his rocket ship nightlight. What's going on, sweetie? I heard a noise. Leo pointed under the bed. Nibbles was playing. He dropped his pebble. His pebble? Uh-huh. He likes to tap it. To say goodnight. Leo's gaze drifted to the dark space beneath his bed frame. A space usually cluttered with forgotten socks and rogue toy cars. He says goodnight to you too, Mommy. Sarah forced a smile. That's nice. But it's time for sleep now, okay? For you and for Nibbles. She smoothed his covers, her hand lingering on his forehead. He felt a little warm, but then he often did after the excitement of playtime. She peered under the bed, seeing nothing but the usual shadows and the faint outline of a lost sneaker. No pebbles, just the pervasive, slightly dusty smell of an area seldom reached by the vacuum cleaner. The pebbles, however, became a recurring theme. Leo would often talk about Nibbles' collection, stored, he said, in a special soft place under the bed. Sometimes, Sarah would hear what sounded like tiny clicks or taps from his room, sounds she attributed to the house settling or perhaps Leo fidgeting. Mark, when she mentioned it, suggested it was probably just mice in the walls, an old house thing. He promised to set some traps, though he never quite got around to it. Then came a cold spot. Leo's room had always been one of the warmer ones in the house, especially in the summer, catching the afternoon sun. But one sweltering July afternoon, Sarah went in to gather Leo's laundry and was struck by a distinct chill emanating from the area around his bed. It was localized, almost as if an invisible window had been left open, letting in a pocket of refrigerated air. She checked the actual window. It was closed tight. The air conditioning vent was on the other side of the room. She knelt, reaching a hand under the bed. The air there was noticeably colder, almost icy. Leo, she called, a tremor of something she couldn't name in her voice. Have you noticed it's cold in here? Lao, engrossed in a drawing at his little desk, looked up. Nibbles likes it cold. He says it reminds him of his old home. His old home. Sarah pressed, trying to keep her tone light. Where was that? Leo shrugged, a typically vague 7-year-old gesture. Under. Just under. He then added, with a gravity that was unsettling. He says the warm makes him sleepy tired. Not good tired. That evening, the whispers seemed to change. Not Leo's whispers to his unseen friend, but something else. Something Sarah almost convinced herself she was imagining. While Leo was in the bath, splashing and narrating an elaborate naval battle with his bath toys, Sarah tidied his room. As she bent to pick up a stray sock near the bed, just the distant sounds of Leo's happy shrieks and Mark clattering dishes downstairs. She told herself it was the wind, a draft, her own mind playing tricks. But the unease planted by the cold spot and the phantom whisper began to take root. She started paying closer attention to Leo's descriptions of Nibbles. They were becoming more detailed. Nibbles, Leo explained, didn't have eyes like people did. His were like shiny buttons but dark. He didn't have hands but long fingers like twigs but soft. And he didn't talk with a mouth, but in your head like a quiet song. These descriptions, delivered with Leo's unwavering conviction, painted a picture far removed from the fluffy bunny or brave knight she might have expected an imaginary friend to be. There was an alien quality to Nibbles, an otherness that pricked at the edges of her comfort. The playful interactions she'd initially observed also began to shift. Leo seemed less in control of the games. Sometimes, she'd find him sitting on his bed, looking pale and anxious, his gaze fixed on the space beneath. "What's wrong, honey?" she'd ask. "Nibbles wants me to stay here," he'd say, his voice small. "He doesn't like it when I go." Or, more worryingly, "Nibbles is hungry. He says the strawberries aren't enough anymore. What else does he want to eat?" Sarah would ask, a knot tightening in her stomach. Leo would just shake his head, his eyes wide with a nascent fear. "He won't tell me. He just says soon." The change in Leo was subtle at first, but undeniable. He, who had always been an energetic, boisterous boy, started to become more subdued, more watchful. Dark circles began to appear under his eyes, as if he wasn't sleeping well, though he never complained of nightmares. He just seemed tired, and increasingly, he seemed afraid of the very space that housed his special friend. The whispers from beneath the bed were no longer just Leo's. They were becoming something else, something that felt chillingly, impossibly real. And they were growing stronger. They were setting the stage for a horror that none of them could yet fathom, a darkness coalescing just out of sight, preparing to make its presence known in ways that would shatter their ordinary world forever. The true nature of Nibbles was yet to be unveiled, but the air in Leo's room was growing heavy with anticipation, cold with a presence that was steadily, patiently, making itself at home. And soon, very soon, it would ask for more than just strawberries. Much more.